There is a document in the Ashmolean Museum that history cannot explain. A clay prism inscribed with a list of rulers that defies every timeline we have been taught to accept. Because it does not record a history of centuries, but a history of 241,200 years. This is the Sumerian king list, and it is the single most dangerous artifact for the conventional narrative of human origins, because it states clearly, without metaphor or apology, that before the Great Flood washed the world clean, the earth was ruled by 8 specific beings who descended from the sky to reign for periods so vast that they shatter our understanding of biology and time. Tonight we are going to read the records that modern archaeology dismisses as myth, to uncover the forbidden history of the Watchers who built the first cities not as temples of worship, but as command centres for a planetary operation that predates humanity itself. The story begins at Eridu, a site in southern Iraq that the ancients called the First City, where excavations have revealed 17 levels of construction going back to the dawn of time, revealing architectural knowledge that appeared fully formed, as if it had been imported rather than developed. The tablets tell us that when kingship descended from heaven, it landed here, in the court of a being named Alulim, who ruled for 28,800 years, establishing a civilization governed not by magic, but by the ME, physical data devices that contained the source code for every technology, law, and social structure required to run a society. These rulers were not alone, for the earliest texts speak of the Agigi, a caste of watchers who did not sit on thrones, but laboured in the deep, dredging the rivers and mining the earth for 2,500 years before humanity was ever created to take their place. They were the workforce of the gods, described in the Atrahasis epic as beings who bore the work and suffered the toil, until the burden became too great and they set fire to their tools, surrounding the sanctuary of the chief administrator Enlil in a rebellion that would force the genetic engineering of a new worker race. This is not a story of divine mystery, but a record of political conflict, labour disputes, and advanced resource management that was categorised as religion only after the flood destroyed the context in which it happened. We find evidence of their presence in the very language of the ancients, where the Sumerian word for these beings evolved into the Akkadian Igigi, and later the Aramaic Ierin, meaning those who watch, or the wakeful ones, a title that implies their primary function was not to be worshipped, but to monitor, to observe, and to control. The centre of this control was the Abzu in Eridu, often mistranslated as a freshwater abyss, but described in the texts as a sophisticated facility where Enki, the master of technology, kept the genetic materials and the ME tablets safe from the other gods. It was from these centres that the civilization of the Watchers spread to Bad Tabira, the city of metalworkers, and Shurapak, the medical centre, creating a global network of functional outposts that would rule the Earth for hundreds of millennia before the ice caps melted and the oceans rose to erase their footprint. The king list is not a fantasy. It is a memory of a time when the atmosphere, the biology, and the rulers of Earth were fundamentally different. A time when the sons of God had not yet mixed their blood with the daughters of men, and the distinction between the terrestrial and the celestial was absolute. As we look deeper into the forbidden records, we realize that the silence of the desert ruins is not an empty silence, but a covered-up history of a golden age that ended in a decision to hit the reset button on the human experiment, a decision that haunts the subconscious of our species to this day. To understand the scale of this lost civilization, we must look at the specific durations recorded in the cuneiform text, where Alaungar followed Alulim and ruled for 36,000 years, creating a dynasty of longevity that suggests these beings were either manipulating time or operating with a biology that was immune to the cellular degradation that defines human mortality. When the kingship moved from Eridu to Bad Tabira, the reign of Enmen-Luana lasted for 43,200 years, a figure that corresponds mathematically to the precession of the equinoxes, suggesting that their rule was synchronized with the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, rather than the frantic pace of human politics. This connection to cosmic cycles is reinforced by the tablet WW200307, which describes 7 primary watchers who possessed the ability to see across the waters of time and perceive events before they occurred, a description that sounds less like prophecy and more like advanced predictive modeling or the manipulation of space-time itself. These watchers, the Apkallu, were the bridge between the high administration of Anu and the primitive world below, emerging from the Persian Gulf in submersible craft that the Babylonians described as fishmen, because they had no other vocabulary for beings who lived in pressurized environments and wore protective suits. The historian Berossus tells us that these beings did not just appear randomly, but followed a strict schedule, instructing humanity during the day in mathematics, astronomy, and the construction of temples, and then retreating into the sea at night, maintaining a rigorous separation between the instructors and the students. The knowledge they transferred was not vague spiritual wisdom, but precise technical data, including the arts of irrigation and metallurgy, which allowed primitive settlements to leapfrog thousands of years of natural development and transform into the urban centers of the Ubaid period. The speed of this transformation is what scholars call the Sumerian problem, the sudden appearance of high civilization in Mesopotamia with no clear developmental precursors, a historical anomaly that makes perfect sense if you accept the Sumerian explanation that the knowledge was given, not learned. The Watchers established a hierarchy of me that governed everything from the weaving of linen to the destruction of cities, a system of control so total that the theft of a single me could shift the balance of power between the gods. This was a civilization of absolute order, managed by the triad of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, who divided the earth into spheres of influence, the sky, the earth, and the subterranean waters, ensuring that no single entity could dominate the entire planet. Enlil's domain was the surface and the air, and the texts describe him as having the power to manipulate the atmosphere, generating storms, and controlling the winds to enforce his will upon the human settlements. Excavations at Nippur, Enlil's command center, have revealed underground chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems that kept the air circulating deep beneath the earth, suggesting that these temples were not just places of prayer, but fortified bunkers, designed to survive environmental catastrophes. Enki's domain, the Abzu, was the center of scientific development, where the clay people were eventually shaped, a reference that the Atrahasis epic clarifies as a process of mixing divine essence with earthly material in a procedure that mirrors modern genetic engineering. The text is uncomfortably specific, describing the use of 14 pieces of clay, 7 for males and 7 for females, implanted with the essence of a slain god to create a hybrid being that could bear the yoke of labor. This was the solution to the rebellion of the Ajiji, the moment when the Watchers outsourced their suffering to a new biological entity, creating a worker race that was intelligent enough to take orders, but genetically limited to ensure they would never challenge their masters. But the system was flawed, because the Watchers who were tasked with monitoring this new species began to deviate from their programming, driven by a curiosity or a desire that would lead to the catastrophic mixing of bloodlines recorded in both the Sumerian tablets and the Book of Enoch. The text, known as the Marriage of Martu, describes the results of these unauthorized unions, the creation of beings who possessed the strength of the gods but the chaotic nature of humans, hybrids who were considered abominations by the Council of Enlil. This was the era of the Nephilim, the time when the men of renown walked the earth and the carefully managed order of the Anunnaki began to collapse into violence and chaos. The Watchers had broken the prime directive of their mission, contaminating the genetic experiment they were supposed to supervise, and as the population of these hybrids exploded, the noise of their civilization, the uproar described by Enlil, began to interfere with the operations of the gods. The decision to erase humanity was not an act of malice, but a cold administrative calculation, a vote taken by the council to flush the system and restart the cycle. The Epic of Gilgamesh records that the gods agreed to keep the coming catastrophe a secret, swearing an oath to let mankind perish in the rising waters, but Enki, the scientist who had created the species, refused to let his work be completely destroyed. He found a way to bypass the oath, speaking to the wall of a reed hut to warn the king Ziusudra, giving him the technical specifications for a submersible vessel that could survive the pressure of the floodwaters. The instructions were precise, detailing the use of bitumen for waterproofing and the design of a roof that would close over the ship, like the Apsu, turning it into a sealed capsule capable of riding out the storm that was about to break the world. When the flood came, it was not just rain, it was a coordinated assault on the planet's climate, with the Anunnaki lifting up their torches to set the land ablaze before the dikes of heaven were opened, a description that suggests tectonic weapons or atmospheric manipulation on a global scale. The archaeological evidence confirms a massive flood event in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC, with flood deposits 8 feet thick separating the layers of civilization, a physical scar left by the water that reset human history. But the Watchers did not disappear. They withdrew. The post-flood world was different. The direct rule of the gods was replaced by the rule of human kings, and the Watchers retreated into the shadows of the temples, becoming the hidden hand that would guide the re-emergence of civilization from behind the veil. The knowledge of the pre-flood world was not lost but buried, preserved in the tablets of destiny and the memories of the survivors, waiting for a time when humanity would again be ready to understand the technology of its creators. This is the secret that the Sumerian king list preserves, that we are the second attempt, the rebooted version of a species that was once intimate with the gods, and that the Watchers are still there, encoded in our DNA and hidden in the ruins of the cities they built, waiting for the stars to return to their places. When the waters of the Great Flood finally receded, they left behind a silence that covered the earth like a shroud, a silence broken only by the wind howling over a landscape stripped of its cities, its gardens, and the noise of the humanity that Enlil had sought to silence. But the Anunnaki had not abandoned the planet. They had merely changed the terms of their engagement. The Sumerian king list records the pivotal moment of the restoration with a single, resonant sentence. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This second descent was different from the first, for the Watchers no longer walked openly among the people as immortal kings, but established a system of proxy rule where human monarchs, the Lugal, served as intermediaries for the gods who had retreated into the sanctity of their high-walled temples. To bridge the gap between the decimated human population and the advanced knowledge necessary to rebuild civilization, the Anunnaki deployed the Apkallu, the 7 sages, who are described in the texts not as men, but as amphibious beings, who emerged from the Persian Gulf to reboot the operating system of humanity. The most famous of these, Oannes, is described by the Babylonian historian Berossus as a being with the whole body of a fish, but with a human head and voice, a description that modern analysts suggest depicts a figure wearing a protective suit or a submersible apparatus designed for the aquatic environment of the post-flood world. These sages were not religious missionaries, they were technicians carrying the ME, the divine decrees that contained the fundamental blueprints for civilization. The texts state explicitly that Oannes and his cohorts taught the survivors the arts of irrigation, metallurgy, and urban planning, instructions that were so precise and complete that the archaeological record shows the sudden, fully formed re-emergence of sophisticated cities, Mesopotamia, without the expected centuries of gradual development. This rapid restoration was driven by the Tablets of Destinies, or Dup-Shimati, which the myths portray as magical stones, but which the descriptions in the Epic of Anzu reveal to be technological devices that shone like the stars and spoke with voices of thunder when activated. These devices were the most valuable assets of the Anunnaki, granting their possessor control over the fundamental laws governing reality, including the ability to manipulate natural forces and issue binding commands to the planetary control grid. The theft of these tablets, as recounted in the myth of the bird demon Anzu, was not a petty crime, but a high-level security breach that threatened the stability of the entire Anunnaki administration, creating chaos because Anzu stole the devices without possessing the specific knowledge to operate them. A detail that confirms these were complex tools requiring biometric or intellectual authorization. With the Watchers withdrawn to the heavens and the sages returning to the Abzu, the new centers of power became the ziggurats, the massive artificial mountains that dominated the skyline of every Sumerian city. Conventional history tells us these were simple platforms for shrines, but the internal architecture of the Anu ziggurat at Uruk reveals a function that was far more utilitarian. Excavations have uncovered acoustic chambers within the structure, rooms tuned to specific frequencies that could amplify sound to extraordinary levels, suggesting that these towers were designed as resonance machines to facilitate communication between the earthly priests and their celestial superiors. The texts describe these installations as the bond of heaven and earth, a literal description of their function as transmission nodes in a network that connected the terrestrial administration with the Anunnaki leadership, who now observed from a distance. The precision of these structures is unnerving. The foundation stones of the Anu ziggurat, some weighing over 50 tons, are fitted with a tolerance measured in millimeters, a feat of engineering that implies the use of the very technologies the Apkallu were sent to preserve. At Nippur, the command center of Enlil, archaeologists found subterranean chambers with sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained air circulation deep underground, evidence of a facility designed to operate independently of the surface environment, perhaps as a bunker or a secure server room for the Duran Key, the bond of heaven and earth that Enlil controlled. This was the era of the demigods, the kings like Gilgamesh who claimed to be 2/3 divine, a ratio that hints at a specific genetic lineage preserved or engineered by the Watchers to maintain a leadership caste capable of interfacing with the ME. But even these enhanced rulers were subject to the new law of mortality. The thousands of years of the antediluvian kings had shrunk to mere centuries, a degradation of the biological template that Enki had once perfected. The tree of life and the plant of heartbeat sought by Gilgamesh were not metaphors for spiritual enlightenment, but biological compounds or medical treatments that could restore the longevity of the Watchers, treatments that were strictly rationed and ultimately denied to humanity. The civilization that rose from the mud of Shuruppak was a cargo cult of the previous age, a society desperately trying to emulate the technology of the gods, using the tools of men, building stone towers to mimic the launch pads of the Anunnaki, and carving prayers into clay to replace the instant communication of the ME. Yet the records indicate that the Watchers never truly left. They simply moved their operations behind the veil of the sanctuary, establishing mystery schools and restricted priesthoods to guard the dangerous knowledge that had once nearly destroyed the world. The 7 sages eventually disappeared, their mission complete, but they left behind a warning, encoded in the stars and the architecture of the ziggurats. The cycle would continue, the stars would return to their places, and the entities who once ruled from the Abzu would one day come back to inspect their creation. The silence of the post-flood world was not a peace. It was a probation, but the footprint of the Watchers is not confined to the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, for the ME of the Anunnaki were not merely local ordinances, but the source code for a planetary civilization that extended its reach into the Nile Valley, where the ancient Egyptians preserved the memory of the same first time, the Zep Tepi, a primordial era when the Neteru, the Watchers or divine principles, descended from the sky to establish the throne of Egypt, long before the first human pharaoh donned the double crown. The Turin King List, a fragile papyrus dating to the reign of Ramesses II, shatters the conventional timeline of Egyptology by listing a dynasty of divine kings who ruled before the unification of Egypt, beginning with Ptah, the creator god, whose reign lasted for 9,000 years, a duration that mirrors the impossible longevity of the Sumerian antediluvian kings, and suggests that the civilization of the Nile was not a separate development, but a sister colony established by the same celestial administration. The parallels between the Egyptian Neteru and the Sumerian Anunnaki are too precise to be coincidental. Ptah, the master craftsman and shaper of the world, is a direct reflection of Enki, the lord of the Abzu and the master of technology, while Ra, the supreme solar authority, occupies the same administrative position as Anu, the sky father who governed from the highest heaven. This connection is physically encoded in the very bedrock of the Giza Plateau, where the underground chambers discovered beneath the pyramid complexes reveal construction techniques that mirror the hydraulic engineering of the Sumerian Absu, featuring granite blocks fitted with a precision measured in fractions of a millimeter and subterranean channels designed to manipulate water tables, suggesting that the tomb of Osiris was not a burial site, but a functional machine utilizing the same fluid dynamics principles found in the temples of Eridu. The pyramid texts, inscribed on the walls of the burial chambers of the 5th dynasty, preserve the most disturbing evidence of the relationship between these divine rulers and their human subjects, particularly in the cannibal hymn, which describes the pharaoh hunting and consuming the Neteru to absorb their heka, or magic, a ritualistic echo of a genetic transfer technology where the human elite sought to ingest the divine essence, or DNA, of the Watchers to acquire their longevity and cognitive capabilities. This consumption was likely a misunderstood memory of a biotechnical procedure, a hormone or stem cell therapy reserved for the ruling class to maintain the blood of the gods in a degrading human genome, explaining why the pharaohs were obsessed with bloodline purity and the preservation of the physical body. The presence of the Watchers in Egypt is further confirmed by the artifacts of the pre-dynastic period, such as the Tomb 100 at Hierakonpolis, which depicts tall, humanoid figures wearing technological headgear and wielding instruments that resemble the tools of the Sumerian Apkallu, clear evidence of a cultural and technological transmission that occurred thousands of years before the official start of history. The unification of Egypt was not the beginning of civilization, but a rescue mission, a re-establishment of order by the followers of Horus, the Shemsu Hor, who acted as the Egyptian equivalent of the Apkallu, carrying the divine knowledge of astronomy, mathematics and engineering from the lost era of the Zep Tepi into the dynastic age. These followers are described as semi-divine beings who kept the knowledge and reconstructed the sacred sites on the exact foundations laid down by the gods, a practice that explains why the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx are aligned to specific stellar configurations that were significant not in 2500 BC, but in 10,500 BC, the era of Leo and Orion, pointing back to the time when the Watchers were physically present on Earth. And the astronomical precision of these monuments, like the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, indicates that the builders possessed a deep time perspective, tracking the precession of the equinoxes, a cycle of 26,000 years, with a mathematical accuracy that requires centuries of data collection, implying that the priests of Heliopolis and Memphis were not religious mystics, but the custodians of an ancient scientific archive inherited from a non-human source. The sudden appearance of hieroglyphic writing, complex medical knowledge, and the ability to cut and transport hard stone on an industrial scale at the very beginning of the First Dynasty is the Egyptian equivalent of the Sumerian problem, a technological explosion that makes no sense in a linear evolutionary model but fits perfectly into the narrative of a rebooted colony utilizing the saved ME, or divine decrees, of a fallen superior civilization. Even the legend of Thoth, the god of wisdom, who buried his books in a secret vault before the Great Flood, parallels the Sumerian story of Sippar and the buried tablets of the Watchers, confirming that the flood myth and the preservation of knowledge are global memories of the same cataclysmic reset. As we stare into the empty sarcophagus of the Great Pyramid, we are not looking at a tomb, but at a resurrection machine, or a frequency chamber designed by the same architects who built the ziggurats, a testament to a global grid of Watchers who ruled the earth from the Nile to the Euphrates, leaving behind stone puzzles that we are only just beginning to solve. The secret history of the pre-flood world is not only written in the stone of the ziggurats, but preserved in the forbidden texts that were deliberately excluded from the canonical Bible, most notably the Book of Enoch, a manuscript that serves as the bridge between the Sumerian records of the Anunnaki and the Hebrew traditions of the fallen angels. This text, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, does not speak of vague spiritual corruption, but describes a specific historical event that occurred on the summit of Mount Hermon, located on the border of modern-day Lebanon and Syria, a strategic high point that dominates the region. It was here that 200 Watchers, led by a commander named Semyaza, descended in the days of Jared and swore a binding oath to violate the prime directive of their order by mixing their genetic stock with the human population and transferring forbidden knowledge to a species that was not yet mature enough to wield it. The curriculum of this unauthorized school of the Watchers is described with a technical precision that mirrors the ME of the Sumerian Apkallu, creating a taxonomy of dangerous technologies that transformed primitive tribes into a weaponized society. Azazel, the second in command, is credited with introducing the technology of warfare, teaching men to fabricate swords, knives, shields, and breastplates, effectively jump-starting the Iron Age in a period that archaeology insists was the Neolithic Stone Age. This was not merely the shaping of metal, but the introduction of industrial metallurgy, including the mining of ore and the chemistry of alloys, knowledge that allowed for the mass production of lethal weapons and the subsequent escalation of human conflict into organized warfare. While Azazel armed the men, other Watchers focused on the psychological and biological manipulation of the species, with Semyaza teaching enchantments and root cuttings, a phrase that scholars interpret as the foundations of pharmacology and the use of psychotropic compounds to alter consciousness or poison enemies. The instruction extended into the cosmetic and social realms, with the teaching of antimony and eye paint, which introduced the concept of seduction and social stratification through appearance, fundamentally altering the egalitarian structure of early human societies. The scientific knowledge transferred was equally advanced and dangerous. Barakiel taught astronomy, Kokabiel taught the constellations, and Tamiel taught the astrology, or the observation of celestial omens, giving humans the ability to track time, navigate vast distances, and predict seasonal cycles, effectively handing them the keys to planetary management. This massive download of data created a technological anachronism, a period where high science coexisted with moral immaturity, leading to a civilization that possessed the power to destroy itself, but lacked the wisdom to restrain its impulses. Archaeological evidence for this intrusion of advanced knowledge can be found in the megalithic ruins that litter the Levant, particularly the massive stone foundation of Baalbek in Lebanon, where trilithon stones weighing over 800 tons are fitted with a precision that defies Roman or Greek engineering, suggesting they are the remnants of the launch pads or landing places used by the Watchers during this period of direct intervention. The text of Enoch describes the inevitable consequence of this breach of protocol, the birth of the Nephilim, the hybrid offspring of the Watchers and human women, who are described as giants who consumed the labour of men and eventually turned on humanity itself. These beings correspond exactly to the Sumerian descriptions of the demigods, or the men of renown, who ruled during the chaotic period preceding the flood, biological experiments that grew uncontrollable and violent, threatening the genetic integrity of the entire planet. The response from the High Council of the Anunnaki, recorded in Enoch as the Holy Ones of Heaven, was a decree of total containment, ordering the arrest of the rebel Watchers and the annihilation of their hybrid children. The leaders, including Semyaza and Azazel, were not killed but bound in the valleys of the earth, imprisoned in specific geological locations where they could no longer influence the surface world, a detail that echoes the Sumerian myth of the bound gods, or the Kur, suggesting that the fallen angels are not mythological demons, but incarcerated biological entities trapped in the subterranean facilities they once built. The Great Flood was the final sterilization procedure for this botched experiment, a hard reset designed to wash away the genetic pollution of the Nephilim and the dangerous technologies of the Watchers, leaving only a selected remnant of pure human stock to repopulate the Earth under a stricter, more distant supervision. Yet, the texts imply that the knowledge could not be completely erased. It survived in the underground repositories and the minds of the survivors like Noah Utnapishtim, who carried the technological secrets of the antediluvian world through the catastrophe, ensuring that the legacy of the Watchers would re-emerge in the sudden, inexplicable rise of the post-flood empires. The forbidden knowledge of Mount Hermon is the foundation of our modern world, our metallurgy, our pharmacology, our astronomy, and our warfare. All seeds planted by a non-human intelligence that broke the rules to accelerate our evolution, leaving us with a civilization that is technically advanced, but spiritually precarious, still struggling to control the fire that was stolen from the gods. The disappearance of the Anunnaki from the surface of the earth did not mark the end of their influence. Instead, it signaled the beginning of a covert era, a time when the forbidden knowledge of the antediluvian world was driven underground, preserved by secret brotherhoods and mystery schools that acted as the custodians of a science they could use, but no longer fully understand. The Babylonian mystery schools, which emerged from the ashes of the Sumerian temples, became the primary vehicles for this transmission, operating within the sanctuaries of Marduk and Nabu, where initiated priests guarded the remnants of the ME with their lives. These were not religious seminaries in the modern sense, but technical institutes, where students underwent decades of rigorous training to master mathematical and astronomical principles that far exceeded the needs of an agrarian society. Knowledge that was clearly inherited rather than discovered. We see the undeniable proof of this inheritance in artifacts like the Plimpton 322 tablet, a clay document dating to 1800 BC that contains a table of Pythagorean triples, so advanced that it demonstrates an understanding of trigonometry and calculus that would not be discovered by Greek mathematicians for another 1,000 years. This tablet is not a record of a developing science, it is a cheat sheet, a copy of a much older, more sophisticated system that utilized a base 60 numerical framework, the sexagesimal system given by the Anunnaki, to perform calculations of celestial mechanics with a precision that rivals modern computers. The existence of such mathematics in the Bronze Age is a smoking gun of external intervention, proving that the Babylonians were accessing a reservoir of knowledge that allowed them to predict planetary motions and eclipse cycles with an accuracy that their own instruments could not possibly support. This legacy of impossible knowledge extends into the medical realm, where the Edwin Sangreal, or blood royal, was the obsession of the ancient world, the reason for the incestuous marriages of the pharaohs and the strict breeding protocols of the Sumerian nobility. They were trying to preserve the fading genetic enhancements of the Watchers, the extended lifespans and the heightened cognitive abilities that had once allowed their ancestors to commune directly with the gods. The mystery schools of Babylon and Egypt were established to protect this bloodline and the technology that supported it, eventually passing their secrets to the Greeks, the Masons, and the esoteric orders of the West, ensuring that the geometric principles of the ziggurats would be encoded in the Gothic cathedrals of Europe and the monuments of the modern world. The Eye of Providence on the dollar bill is not a vague symbol of divinity, it is the Igigi Eye, the symbol of the watcher who observes the labour of the human workforce from the summit of the incomplete pyramid, a silent reminder that the hierarchy established in Eridu has never truly been dismantled. As we widen our lens to the edges of the known world, the evidence of this global administration becomes impossible to ignore, manifesting in the out-of-place megaliths that shatter the timeline of human evolution. In the highlands of Turkey, the site of Göbekli Tepe stands as a defiant monument to the Watchers, a temple complex dating to 9500 BC, thousands of years before the official invention of agriculture or pottery, where massive T-shaped pillars are arranged in astronomical alignments that mirror the stars of the Cygnus and Orion constellations. The reliefs carved into these stones depict not just animals, but the handbags held by the Sumerian Apkallu and the Olmec gods of Mexico, a standardized symbol of the ME technology that spans continents and epochs, proving that the sages were operating on a global scale immediately following the cataclysm of the Younger Dryas period. These pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, were quarried and moved by a people who supposedly had not yet invented the wheel, a paradox that can only be resolved by accepting the presence of a transfer technology, a moment where the survivors of the flood were given the tools to jump-start civilization by the very beings who had previously sought to erase it. The global distribution of these cyclopean walls, from the polygonal masonry of Sacsayhuaman in Peru to the granite valley temples of Giza, demonstrates a unified architectural style characterized by anti-seismic interlocking stones and knobs that suggest a functional, perhaps acoustic purpose rather than a decorative one. This was the infrastructure of the post-flood reconstruction, a grid of power centers built on the ruins of the old world to stabilize the planet and re-establish the control of the Anunnaki Council. But this reconstruction came with a condition, a deadline encoded in the very movements of the stars that the Watchers taught us to observe. The Sumerian texts speak of the Great Year, the cyclical rotation of the heavens, and warn that just as the stars return to their places, so too will the gods return to theirs. The silence of the Anunnaki is not an abandonment, it is a waiting period, a time of observation where the human experiment is allowed to run its course without direct intervention, monitored by the silent watchers of the angelic orders who report back to the holy ones described in the Book of Enoch. The tablet K3657 and the prophecy of the return of the Anunnaki suggest that this period of silence is drawing to a close, that the cycle which began with the descent of kingship at Eridu and paused with the deluge is approaching its final phase. We are living in the echo of their technology, using the mathematics they taught us to build weapons they forbade, replicating the genetic errors of the Nephilim in our own laboratories, and ignoring the warnings they left in stone. The question is not whether they existed. The millions of bricks of the ziggurats, the genetic anomalies in our DNA, and the impossible knowledge of the ancients answer that. The question is what will happen when the Watchers decide that the noise of humanity has once again become too loud. The forbidden records of Sumer do not end with a period. They end with a question mark, leaving us to look at the sky and wonder if the Guardians are preparing to descend for the final inspection.